David has assisted the History Channel, Learning Channel, Discovery, Science, and Smithsonian channels on UFO documentaries. And he has one of the world's largest libraries at his home, right here in Rio Rancho. Probably the world's largest collection of UFO files and the books and the videos and photographs. And he has the original photograph of the Los Angeles air raid of 1942, the Battle of Los Angeles. He has the original photo taken by a UPI photographer. And so it's amazing. But I would like to welcome David Marler, author of Triangular UFOs, a fascinating subject. So David Marler, come over here.
For those of you that may have caught Channel 13 News, I was talking about triangular UFOs. It's an area that I've been researching now for at least 10 years actively. My interest is in the overall history and research of the UFO subject, but specifically triangular UFOs. And I'll give you a little bit of my background, and I think it'll explain why my interest is what it is. So the title is Triangular UFOs, an estimate of the situation, and that's what we're going to try to do, is estimate the situation that we're dealing with specific to these triangular UFOs. Well, all of us come with different perspectives, different thresholds of belief or acceptance, and the one thing I always like to mention is UFOs, fact, fiction, folklore, whatever you relegate it to, it's part of our history, part of our culture. You know, even people that don't, I hate to use the term, believe in UFOs, will acknowledge that it's part of our sociology, it's part of our culture. So that's how I like to look at it. We've been dealing with this mystery now actively since 1947, so we're looking at about 65 plus years of active research, both on the part of the military, United States and otherwise, and civilian organizations. So we have amassed a lot of files. As Norio was very gracious, he said I have one of the largest collection. I have one of the largest collections of case files and material. But there's a wealth of data there, and we do a fairly good job, both in MUFON and other organizations, of investigating reports. But it does no good to simply take that report, file it away, and then move on to the next case. We need to look at the body of data that we've collected over decades and see if there's any patterns that exist in the data. If there are, it's suggested that we're dealing with a genuine phenomenon. Well, I think I found some patterns with regard to the triangular UFO phenomenon. This is just some of the collection that I have on file. I've had several researchers. Greg was over yesterday. Norio's been over. Also had Michael Schratt make a couple of treks from Arizona to come and go through some of the files. That's just a sampling of a little bit of what I have in the way of information. But the development of the UFO phenomenon, when we think about it, really goes back to, at least in the modern age, June 24th, 1947. 9 saucer or crescent-shaped objects were sighted over Mount Rainier by Kenneth Arnold, who was a private pilot. And he was actually misquoted by a United Press reporter when asked, how did these objects fly? And he stated, well, it was as if you took a saucer and skipped it across the water. And with many journalists, they tend to misquote you, and they said that Arnold saw a flying saucer. So this is kind of the iconic imagery, you know, the saucer or circular shaped objects that we've had for decades now. And some people might kind of consider me an iconoclast in the sense that I'm kind of smashing that traditional image, because we're going to be talking about a shift or a change that we've seen in the UFO literature roughly since 1989 as far as the general public was concerned. In 1989, as was referenced earlier by Michael Schratt, specifically November 29th, 1989, a gigantic wave or flap of UFO sightings occurred involving large triangular objects moving at low altitude over the Belgian countryside. The vast majority of these eyewitnesses consisted of the Belgian gendarmerie, which was the police at the time, and many eyewitness accounts occurred, multiple eyewitness accounts. More importantly, the Belgian military also acknowledged that they were dealing with a genuine phenomenon, which was unheard of in military circles. It's very strange. You would never hear the United States military making a statement that we're dealing with a genuine phenomenon and we can't control it. But that's essentially what the Belgian military was stating. So that was my introduction into the triangular UFO mystery. Actually, a Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, article in which they covered the case. It was actually extensively written up by reporter Bob Pratt. And this is just one sketch of one of the objects that was seen over Brussels. As you can see there, December 1st, 1989. So numerous reports throughout Brussels and the surrounding area, all the way over to Upan, this village right here on the German-Dutch border. And that was the November 29th, 1989 sighting. But the sightings continued. Quite often in UFO literature, in the UFO history, we find waves of activity where one day there are no UFOs being reported in a given area, and then suddenly a wave or an increase in sightings occur. It may be for days, weeks, months, or years. In this case, it went from November '89 to the spring of 1991. And they literally have hundreds of cases on file, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I think it was interesting because General de Brouwer of the Belgian Air Force on July 11, 1991 held a press conference in which he not only discussed the validity of these sightings, the fact that there appears to be a genuine reality to it, but more importantly, they talked about the fact that 2 F-16 jet interceptors were dispatched after 4 separate ground-based radar tracking stations had locked onto an unknown target at the same time it was being viewed by the gendarmerie and other citizens on the ground. So we had radar data in this case. It's not just simple hallucinations, it's not just simple eyewitness testimony taken at face value. And the radar confirmation was rather interesting. These objects were performing flight characteristics unlike any conventional aircraft then or today. But what personally ushered me into the triangular UFO phenomenon was a case that was touched on by Michael Schrapp earlier, namely the January 5th, 2000 Southern Illinois case. I just moved to Rio Rancho 2.5 years ago. Prior to that time, I actually lived in the eastern side of St. Louis on the Illinois side of the river, and this area is very familiar to me. But what essentially transpired, and I discussed this on a number of documentary shows over the years, you're probably familiar with it, we had a large object, a UFO, moving at low altitude, coming in from the northeast over the village or town of Highland, Illinois. It then moved down towards Summerfield, which at this point it was observed by the Lebanon, Illinois police officer. Then it made this incredible acceleration with a complete absence of a sonic boom, despite the fact it did go supersonic. The object was then sighted by a Shiloh police officer, who then saw it move off to the southwest. It was then seen by a Millstock police officer, and then seen later by a Dupo officer, who said that he saw it increasing in altitude and returning to the northeast. That was the initial report. These sightings occurred between 4 a.m. and roughly 4:50 a.m. We were able to get the police dispatch recordings that corroborate this and help validate this sighting. One of the important notes to mention, though, is the fact that Scott Air Force Base was within an estimated 1 to 1.5 miles of this sighting. And as a result, local St. Louis media thought perhaps this might be something military. To be quite honest, when I go into a UFO investigation, I try to find the most practical explanation, as I think Greg alluded to earlier. And certainly my idea at the time was perhaps this was something military, given its close proximity to Scott Air Force Base. However, taking a step back, remembering the cases and the reports, the eyewitness testimony of the gendarmerie in Belgium 10 years prior, as I'm sitting interviewing these police officers in the police department, sitting across from their desk, they're describing in exact detail what was described in Belgium by the gendarmerie. So I began to think to myself, perhaps there's a connection here, not only with the way that the objects appeared, but the way that they actually flew, the flight dynamics. So I thought that was rather interesting. So, new insights into the case. I've been investigating this now for several years. Additional eyewitness testimonies come forward. My friend and fellow researcher Daryl Barker in St. Louis has done extensive research in this as well. But we now believe, and I document in my book the new information, we now believe that as incredible as one UFO flying near a major military installation and being sighted by at least 4 to 5 police officers, we now believe there were actually 2 triangular UFOs and a rectangular UFO that was also sighted in the vicinity at the time. And again, all of this is in the book. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into detail, but I just want to illustrate that it was this case that I personally investigated that really brought the triangular UFO mystery to my front door. So again, the parallels that existed, and by the way, I've been having ongoing communication with the Belgian investigators. I just had a Skype conference with Patrick Farron, who's in charge of the Sovets group in Belgium that did the investigations from '89 to '91. And he agreed with me that the shape of the object between southern Illinois and Belgium were the same, the lighting characteristics were the same, complete absence of noise, flight characteristics, namely the ability for these objects to hover, stationary, silent, with no downdraft. We're not talking helicopters here. rapidly accelerate from a dead stop, turn abruptly, and make sharp, flat turns as opposed to a conventional aircraft that banks when it turns. The other thing was the police officers, all neighboring police officers from neighboring municipalities that were in radio contact with each other. So we have credible witnesses, and I always like to emphasize, police officers are deemed credible. Otherwise, their testimony would not be admissible in a court of law. But they can convict any one of us of a crime if we were engaged in that, if they were to go to court and testify. Their testimony is no less valid just because they've cited an unconventional aerial object. So I think we need to take these officers at their word, especially when in the Belgian case we have radar confirmation to back it up. But what I found is going through the history, Belgium and Illinois had earlier reports of triangular UFOs, and this is where we get into the history. One case, it was another wave of sightings that occurred in Belgium, ironically enough, in and around Brussels and to the east of Brussels. This was in July 1972. I found this in Flying Saucer Review magazine, and ironically enough, it was also investigated by the same group, SOBEPS, in Belgium. And the majority reported 3 lights in a triangular pattern. Some actually described objects that were in the shape of a triangle. And again, the flight dynamics, the characteristics were shockingly similar. So we're looking at 2000 Southern Illinois, we're looking at Belgium, 1989 to 91. Now we're going back into 1972 and looking at sightings in Belgium. Well, in Illinois, I found this case from Winona, Illinois, 1979. And this was an individual solitary witness, but I think the title of the article here says it all. Low-flying triangle in Illinois. Again, 1979. So there is a history of these sighting reports involving triangular objects. But then I began to think, okay, I have all of this material at my disposal. If there are parallels between these cases, are there additional parallels? So this began my journey looking at the history of case files that we have. Some numbers to kind of put to this. National UFO Reporting Center statistics, UFO shapes reported as of November 2004. If you look down here, the largest number, no surprise, is the category of light, which I think all of us here will agree that's pretty ambiguous. Could that be a satellite? Could that be a star? Could that be a planet? But when we look at geometric shapes, in addition to that category of light, triangle over here on the very end, 2,782 reports. So that's second related to the 5,509 reports of lights. Now, contrast that to disc-shaped UFOs, 2,439. So the saucers are starting to take a back seat, so to speak, to what's being reported. We're now having these triangular UFOs with increasing prevalence. This was in my early historical research back in November 2004. I was preparing a lecture for a conference I spoke at in Arkansas, and I was surprised to see that the statistics still held true. So in February 2012, what are we looking at? And again, these are cumulative totals. The category of light, 13,997 reports. Again, what is the next runner-up? Triangular UFOs being reported, 6,957 compared to 5,288 of the classic flying disc reports. So we are seeing a shift. Most investigators know this. MUFON is aware of this as well. They're getting an influx of reports of these objects. But I think it's important to look at some statistics, put some numbers to it. So just like to share that. And a sign of the times. If you're not interested in numbers or statistics, just look at the books that have been released in the last few years. What happened to the classic ubiquitous flying disc that we often used to see on the 1950s, 60s UFO books? Now they're being replaced by these triangular UFOs. These are just a couple examples in addition to my own book. But the prevailing argument, a lot of people say, well, this triangular phenomenon is something new, therefore it must be something military. Well, I'd like to punch holes in the fact that these aren't new, and hopefully by the end of this presentation you'll agree with me. And it really makes you question the military explanation, and at least explaining all of these reports. Like Michael Schrett alluded to earlier, I am fully convinced that some of these triangular UFOs could be black operations, could be black projects that Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and other defense contractors are working on. So I would say wrong on that argument. But the history of reports, let me just share just a few. And again, what's in my book is a distillation of a multitude of reports of these triangular UFOs. Here's one, new saucer twist, flying triangle seen in state. This was from the 1960s. This is from the Hartford Courant. And you look at the description, you look at the lighting characteristics, this is very similar to what's being reported today. 1955, this is California. Now it's flying triangle, strange object seen in La Crescenta skies. Describes a large triangular UFO. Seeing is believing, Malibu man describes triangular shaped UFO, 1978. We look on, 1960s, mystery flying triangle spotted flashing over north. This was from the UK. That triangle is no plane, says expert. And this is another one. This is actually from Cardiff, Wales. So describing a multitude of different objects. But the one question I get asked when I do interviews, whether it's on television or radio, how far do these reports go back? Or at least based on your research, how far have you been able to find these reports go back? One of the all-time classics for any old-timers that are here that remember this book, it's one of the all-time classics in the field. The Flying Saucers Are Real by retired Marine Major Donald Kehoe. And Donald Kehoe was a bulldog when it came to investigating UFOs, but more importantly, challenging the military and government establishment with regard to the cover-up. And Donald Kehoe, in his book from 1950, states, in one of his chapters, most accounts describe them as roughly triangular, about 100 feet on the base and 200 feet on the sides. And this was regarding sightings of UFOs in the Dutch East Indies in 1890. Now, what's interesting is not just the triangular shape, but the size estimate, 100 feet on the base, 200 feet on the sides. This matches the majority of reports both in Belgium as well as the police officers from the Southern Illinois case. And yet we're talking 1890. Later in his book, he talks about a wave over England and Scotland in the year 1895, and he goes on to state triangular shaped objects like those seen in the Dutch East Indies. So 1895 reports of large triangular UFOs. Well, really it comes down to this, and I think Greg alluded to this, do you believe in aliens or do you believe in military projects?